Here we are. So, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of ITSS Verona Members Series podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Andrea, and I am from the Africa team. And we are here with my colleagues Leonardo, Pesci, and Massimiliano Dosmo. And we have a great guest with us, which is Professor Koen Vlassenroot. And he is a professor of political science at the University of Ghent, where he directs the Center of Armed Groups that aims at understanding armed groups and civil war. He's, he has extensive field work and he is an expert in conflicts and peace studies. So first of all, thank you so much for being with us today. It's very much an honor, and since you're leading expert on the Congo and the conflict that is happening now in the Eastern Congo. So if it's okay, we would like to start with a little bit of a difficult question, which is a little bit understanding the origin of the recent and the older events and the players that are happening in the Eastern Congo. So some experts pick as the origin of the current conflict, the Rwandan genocide, and the two Congo wars and the aftermath of the genocide and the wars. Other are more focused on the democratic transition and the difficult democratic transition since the end of the Mobutu regime. So our first question would be a little bit to understand and to have a little bit of focus on the Eastern Congo. What are the most important actors in both political and ethical way, and what is the origin of the conflict in your opinion?
That's a big question indeed.
It is.
So the Congo War, actually violence in Eastern Congo started already in the early 90s of the previous century. So we have to go back almost more than 32 years to be correct. It was a mixture of a number of dynamics. We were witnessing the end of the Mobutu regime, which was indeed economically speaking, going through difficult times because of high levels of corruption and state deficiency. The entire system was collapsing. We were also at the end of the Cold War, so external support was made dependent on a number of conditions like democratization, good governance, respect for human rights, and all these matters of what we have later on called the liberal peace ideology. And at the moment that you have an imploding political regime, economically, politically, militarily, there is violence happening in Burundi, pushing a few 100,000 people into the then Zaire as refugees, and that was in 93, and in 94 you have the Rwandan genocide, and as a consequence also a huge wave of refugees settled in Eastern Zaire, including members of the Rwandan regime, which lost control, which actually executed the genocide, but in the end lost control and was replaced by a new rebel force, the RPF. So you get a very toxic brew of all sorts of elements, some national, some regional. And in addition, on a local level, because of that democratization, which was introduced by Mobutu as a way of dividing political opponents, there was a lot of tension going on who was a citizen and who could be a candidate in elections, who could vote, who could be recognized as full citizens, and there was centered around the position of a number of people living in Eastern Congo, which have a background, in some cases going back lots of decades, even more than 100 years in some cases, which have their origins in Rwanda, the so-called Banya-Rwanda, those coming from Rwanda, including Hutu people and Tutsi people. So the struggle was gradually also centering around their claims for citizenship, but also their claims for access to land. Now, I'm going very much back into history. I'm aware of this, but I think it's important to understand that one of the dynamics around which this conflict continues to be centered is already there, even going back to the 50s and 60s. Now, this Banya Rwanda, many coming from Rwanda, and some of them as part of the independence struggle in Rwanda, mainly Tutsi, settling in Eastern DRC, make that the logics of the genocide become also connected to that part of the Congolese population. We see the first appearance of armed groups fighting against particularly Hutu Banyarwanda for the access to land. These Hutu claiming access to land through customary leaderships, which they didn't have before. And then you get all these refugees coming in, including the former Rwandan government troops, the Rwandan army, including the Interahamwe and militia, which helped executing the genocide. And then you have an extremely difficult situation. Now, these refugees got the support from Mobutu, and in the end, you have a regional crisis posing a serious security threat to Rwanda. And that was one of the triggers to organize a first rebel movement in '96, which was headed by Laurent Désiré Kabila, and which had to deal with the security threat coming from those refugee camps. So that is a start. Now, Kabila and his coalition of several Banyarwanda groups, young people being mobilized, and so on, they all had the support of Uganda, of Rwanda mainly. They succeeded in getting rid of Mobutu. Kabila replaced Mobutu, but then in the end, he was facing a serious problem. He was put into power with the help of Rwandan army, the new Tutsi regime, and if he wanted to gain ground in local Congolese society, he had to take a distance of Rwanda, which he eventually did about a year after he took power in '97. So in '98 he told Rwanda to leave the territory, Rwandan troops to leave the territory, and that was a trigger for Rwanda to start a new rebel group again, largely composed by Banyarwanda, largely by Hutu and Tutsi, and Banyamulenge, who live in South Kivu. And this time it was against the new regime, which actually was put in place a year before, headed by Laurent Désiré Kabila. I'm not sure if you're still with me, but
Yeah, no, absolutely,
we're
absolutely.
only at the start of the whole story. So what was expected as a repetition of '96 didn't happen. There was an involvement of a number of troops from the region, support from Zimbabwe and Angola to the regime in Kinshasa, the Kabila regime, while on the other hand you had a rebel group supported by Uganda and Rwanda. Now, this rebel group didn't have that same cohesion and didn't seem to have the same military capacity to provoke that regime shift quickly, and at some point started to disintegrate for several reasons. But one of the important reasons was that there was a fallout between Uganda and Rwanda, both supporting that rebel group. There were a number of military confrontations between both armies in the city of Kisangani, and it triggered in the end a fragmentation of this rebel movement, which was called the RCD. That rebel movement, one part still connected to Rwanda, was partly mainly operating in South Kivu and the southern part of North Kivu, and everything further up now was supported by Uganda. So you had a split off, and that was the start of military fragmentation. At the same time, remember in '93 we had these first rural armed groups fighting for access to land. They also were getting bigger and bigger, and actually mobilizing around that narrative of, well, there is a foreign invasion or a territorial integrity is on the threat. We need to get organized and to kick them out. And that is where this became more and more important. At the same time, the my received support, military support from Kinshasa to fight against this new rebel force. Now, in the end, despite the fact that the country was split up in a number of zones of influence, a peace agreement was signed, leading to the all-inclusive peace agreement, which was announcing a transition phase in 2003, with Kabila no longer the one who took over power in 97, excuse me, but his son, because his father was killed. His son remained the president, and then there were 4 vice presidents composed by different armed groups and the non-armed opposition. And you had the transition phase, which had to prepare elections, and for the first time we had those elections in 2006. Since then, we have had different rounds of elections. Now, you would say, okay, there's a peace agreement. That's the end of the story, the end of the conflict. Exactly. So we see that a number of issues have not been dealt with. That international support to bring peace, including a huge UN force of peacekeepers, one of the biggest at the time, it was not sufficient to stop violence. These armed groups, these Mai, all got integrated in this new army, but in the end, it were mainly the commanders who profited from that. So the rank and file, the small combatants, let's say, they didn't gain anything out of this. And at the same time, we see that this new rebel group, the end of the rebel group RCD, politically could not weigh on the situation as much as they would have loved to. And in the East, you see a continuing proliferation of armed groups. Even more so, you see more and more armed groups appearing. So in 2009, it was decided to have a peace process again in order to get all these armed groups into the formal institutional framework of the Congolese state, including the Congolese army. About a little bit more than 20 armed groups participated in this peace process, the Goma peace process. Today we are talking about more than 100 armed groups. So we see a constant fragmentation of armed groups. We can go into that later on if you want to. But the 2009 peace agreement was also again trying to keep a number of Tutsi soldiers in the Congolese army. So a deal was signed also with that Tutsi part, which had organized its new rebel force, the CNDP, headed by Laurent Nkunda. And then eventually, we're talking now about 2009. Eventually, there is a sort of an integration, but 2 years later, part of that Tutsi group decided to leave the Congolese army again and to institute the M23 rebel movement. And the first military campaign of the M23 brought them into the streets of Goma. They occupied the city for a couple of days, but then they were militarily defeated. They did so with a lot of support from Rwanda. There was a huge international reaction, putting pressure on Rwanda, and eventually all the different instruments of pressure, but also the military development made that the M23 was military defeated, and a new military and a new negotiation and agreement was negotiated. So the M23 actually refers to that first peace agreement, March 23, 2009, which for M23 was not executed the way they wanted. It was not respected, and that's why they took up arms again against the Kabila regime. Now, 2017, they tried again. Not much happened. It was only after the arrival into power of Tshisekedi and some talks which didn't lead to a successful conclusion that at the end of 2021, the same M23 relaunched its military campaign, and from there on gradually took village after village after village until things became much bigger, much more important, and ending at the end of January this year with the arrival in Goma, and then later on the arrival in Bukavu, and they keep on expanding their territory. So now they are occupying a vast part of Eastern Congo. In comparison with the previous military campaign of 2011-12, we see that today they are not there to show their force and just show that they can occupy a city. They are imposing their own governance structures. They are appointing new governors and new mayors of smaller places of villages and smaller cities and so on. So they are really trying to install a new administration in support of their project. Two more things. One is that actually a new player was added to the M23, the Alliance du Fleuve du Congo, which is a political movement claiming, actually imposing a larger agenda than the M23. The M23 is about respect for the citizenship rights of the Tutsi, facilitating a return of Tutsi refugees who are still in Rwanda all those years, protection of their land, also a rather, would say, localized agenda, while the AFC, that political wing, has a much more political agenda, and they want a regime shift. They were instituted end of 23, but there's a lot of discussion whether these are two separate groups. But if you look at the membership of both groups, there is at least very strong ties between both, and they usually sign their press declarations together. So you see that there is a shift from a rather localized agenda centered around protection of the Tutsi, also against security threats coming from a Hutu rebellion, which is still operating in Congo since all those years. So those who came with these refugees, this Interahamwe, there are some remnants still in Eastern Congo. They have changed names several occasions, but in the end, this is also considered as an important security threat. So that is one thing. A second element that I wanted to add is that we should be very careful here to not only read this conflict as a war between M23 and Kinshasa. There's about 100, 120. That number doesn't say much, but the armed groups. So there is a huge military fragmentation. There's a lot of smaller armed groups occupying parts of territory, present in other parts, in some parts even more powerful than in others. And what happened in 2021 was that Tshisekedi, who was preparing already the next elections, he used that narrative of war, of territorial integrity under pressure because M23 again was supported by Rwanda. He started mobilizing so-called reserve force, and many of these armed groups could strengthen their position as part of that call to join the fight against this what he called an occupation. There's lots of reasons why we see this intensification. I'm very happy to go into that if you want to. But the election process was also one of the reasons why we see that strengthening of all those armed groups, which was the election process, which was combining the elections with that security threat in Eastern DRC. So it's a very complicated, very fragmented security landscape.
The question was also very broad.
Yes. Today, a considerable part of Eastern DRC is particularly of the southern parts of North Kivu and some parts of South Kivu is controlled by the M23. But around that, you have a lot of armed groups who gained strength because of the last 3 years of mobilization and so on, also imposing their rule. And that is creating a very confusing and very dangerous situation for people living there, of course.
Yeah.
Now, Eastern Congo is not the only reason for concern. There's other parts in Congo facing also intensified violence over the last few years. Ituri is one of those provinces. We've had a very violent conflict in Ituri between 1999 and 2003. Today, we see again that a number of armed groups are gaining strength. Some want to connect to the M23, others want to mobilize and fight against the M23. So while there is more than the M23, the operations of many of these armed groups is today, in one way or another, oriented towards this M23. So that is a shift
It
compared
is
to the
also probably the one that has now the most resonance also for how fast he was in conquering territory recently again.
Exactly.
Maybe Leonardo can also, we can ask another question. So just to, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor, for this very huge historical, cultural snapshot on DRC, because it was very huge and hard to sum up, but I think that you made a very great job. Thank you very much for that. We have 10 to 12 minutes left, and I would like to ask a concise question that it's not very concise, but I will try to make it concise. So North and South Kivus are kind of the richest areas in terms of natural resources in the DRC, especially in the sector of gold and coltan. So in this sense, the alleged ties between M23 group and the Rwanda government have raised concern over smuggling of resources and exploitation from the Rwanda government of these natural resources of DRC. So keeping this in mind, we were wondering while preparing this interview, what are, in your opinion, the final objectives of M23? Would they rather be interested in governing at the national level, or rather is more strategic to remain in the eastern side, in the eastern regions of DRC? And relatedly, what is the role of resources in the conflict today? Is it playing an important role? Does it intersect with the strategic interest of other external or great powers? I don't know, France, US, China. Again, it's very broad. I'm sorry for that.
Yes, and I have to keep an eye on time in answering this. This is the big question, of course. What is the role of resources? We've seen over the last 15, 20 years that the dominant narrative when we talk about conflict in Eastern Congo is it's all about resources, right? We all have parts of Congo in our pockets, so we shouldn't buy an iPhone anymore because it's full of minerals coming from Eastern Congo. I have to disappoint you. It's much more complicated than that. It would be a mistake to say that resources do not play a role at all. But this conflict is not about resources or not about resources alone. The economy of Eastern Congo has been oriented towards the east for a long time. One reason is geography. It's much easier to when you are a farmer in Eastern Congo or you're a smuggler and you want to sell your stuff to just cross the border to Burundi, to Uganda, to Rwanda. So that is this historical connection is there, and so different networks connecting actors on both sides of the territory actually they have existed for a long time. In a way, we can see that these networks have become militarized over the years because of the involvement of military actors. It could be armed groups, it could be Congolese army, you name it, but a number of armed actors have become involved in some UPDF commanders, the Ugandan army. So it has become something more important, also militarily, politically speaking, control over these networks. Now, so in other words, the borders between countries are, in this perspective, not a problem but an opportunity. They help to create these kind of networks around smuggling and so on, or illegal exploitation and so on. Now, many of these networks, they exist already. And if you look at the export figures of Rwanda and the importance of gold, for instance, but also other commodities, of which much is coming from Eastern DRC, probably a large part of it. Some reports also say that some of the gold exported by Rwanda is coming from Central African Republic because Rwanda has its peacekeepers there. But then this question arises for like, okay, these networks are there, the traffic is already going from one country to another, many people are having a share in this. Why would you start a war when these things are already in place? If you look at the M23, of course, a rebel movement needs income. Otherwise, it's not going to survive. But until April 2024, M23 was not controlling any mine. It was only then that the Rubaya coltan mine came under control of the M23. So 2.5 years of military campaign without having access to minerals. That means that the money is coming from elsewhere, and it's from taxes imposed, the control of border posts. All these things help to gain an income. So, what is the larger picture behind this? It's a very interesting question. What is exploited in Eastern Congo is particularly important on a regional level. It is connecting markets at both sides of the border: Congo, Uganda, Congo, Rwanda, Congo, Burundi, Congo, Tanzania. And then you have copper and so on, which is exploited in much more to the south, the former Katanga, and that's where the big money is being made. That's much bigger than cobalt and copper is a much bigger industry and market than what is exploited in Eastern Congo. Gold might be an exception today because of the gold price. Now, there's been a number of attempts to have a deal also between Rwanda and Congo, which went wrong. And this, but I don't think that is the main reason why this war is happening. M23 today is controlling a much bigger share of the exploitation of resources because it is expanding its territory. But I think they want to create a zone where they feel safe, they feel protected, and they can impose their own rule. Some sort of buffer zone. That is I don't think the objective of M23 is to go to Kinshasa. The objective of the IFC, that political wing, maybe, but they don't have the military capacity. So in other words, if they want to put an end to the Tshisekedi regime, they probably will have to do it on their own, without the military support of M23. Does that mean that it's going to stop here soon? Maybe not. Maybe M23 want to expand its territory. But also another factor to keep in mind is that, well, this Rwandan support, military support, for how long is that going to continue? That might change as well, and at some point the M23 might face a situation where it has to organize its own structures and its own control over that vast territory without the help of Rwanda, at least with the boots on the ground and all these kind of things. So that is where we are heading towards.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, like, it's due to time constriction, unfortunately, we have to conclude the interview. It was very interesting, and thank you a lot for a lot of insights. And I think we touched a lot of different topics, and very interesting also the role of natural resources in this conflict. So thank you, Professor Koen Vlassenroot, for your time and for your precious insight. I don't know if you want to say like something quick just to conclude this interaction.
Well,
Less than 2 minutes.
You can never do justice to this conflict. It's impossible to explain this in such a short period of time, and there's so many other elements which we couldn't cover. So which is normal. It's complex, yes, but also there is a huge crisis going on. So we should mobilize and those who can make a difference and put an end to this cycle of violence. I think that is really key today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much for being
You're
with us, and thank you also for Andrea and Leonardo for conducting this interview along with me. So thank you a lot, and we wish you a great evening, and thank you. Yeah.
Take care.